On a quiet Sunday morning in 1941, Oahu felt like a place untouched by worry. The warm Hawaiian breeze drifted gently over the island, carrying the sounds of a world still half asleep. Even the presence of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, newly settled in at Pearl Harbor after moving from San Diego, seemed more like a proud reminder of American confidence than a warning of what was coming. Lined neatly beside Ford Island sat 7 massive battleships, an entire row of steel giants that locals had come to call Battleship Row. To anyone who saw them, they looked unshakable, symbols of a nation certain of its strength. But as the sun crept higher, another sound began to rise, faint at first, an approaching swarm of aircraft that would soon carve its name into history. What began as a peaceful morning would become one of the defining moments of the 20th century, the attack on Pearl Harbor. At the turn of the 20th century, few outside Asia truly understood Japan's growing power. To many Western nations, Japan was seen as a regional player. Important, yes, but hardly a force capable of reshaping global influence. Europe still assumed its grip on places like China was secure, and old prejudices blinded many to the shifts happening in the Far East. All of that changed on May 27, 1905. War had broken out between Japan and one of the oldest empires, Imperial Russia. Far from home, on open waters, the two nations prepared for a battle that would shape the future of naval warfare. Most military minds believed Russia's mighty fleet would crush Japan with ease. Instead, history took a different turn. In a stunning display of strategy and discipline, Japan not only defeated the Russian fleet, they destroyed it almost completely, suffering only light losses themselves. It was a moment that announced Japan's arrival on the world stage. Japan's unexpected victory sent ripples across the world, ripples that few fully understood at the time. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a major European empire. Russia's pride was shaken, its influence weakened, and the cracks that appeared in 1905 would later help lead to World War I and even the Russian Revolution. For Japan, however, the win sparked a powerful sense of confidence. The military began to rise in influence, drawing inspiration from old samurai traditions and the disciplined spirit of the warrior. With this renewed identity, Japan pushed forward, investing heavily in modern weapons and cutting-edge naval technology, the very tools that had helped them triumph over Russia. Soon, Japanese shipyards were producing warships that matched and sometimes surpassed their European rivals. And when World War I erupted, Japan joined the Allies, sending their fleet to the Mediterranean. There, their ships impressed and quietly worried the seasoned admirals of Europe.
As Japan dreamed of building a vast empire, 2 competing visions emerged. One group pushed for the Northern Plan, which called for expansion through Manchuria and into Soviet territory, hoping to seize resource-rich Siberia. Army leaders favored this route, believing a land campaign would secure them funding and influence. They also viewed communism as a major threat and expected the West to overlook, perhaps even welcome, Japan's push north. The Navy, however, supported a different idea, expanding south into Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. This approach promised access to vital resources, but risked confrontation with major colonial powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States. Throughout the 1930s, Japan pursued both paths, though the southern strategy moved more cautiously, often through commercial companies building facilities with hidden military value. Meanwhile, to fuel northern ambitions, Japan targeted Manchuria. In 1931, they staged the Mukden Incident, a minor explosion on a railway line blamed on Chinese saboteurs. The excuse was enough. Japanese troops swept into Manchuria, overwhelming Chinese forces and creating the puppet state of Manchukuo within months. The world condemned the act, but beyond harsh words, little was done. China's internal civil war paused as rival factions united against Japan, receiving some support from the Soviet Union. Ironically, while the U.S. offered China aid, it also sold scrap metal to Japan, material that would soon be turned into weapons of war. As the conflict in China deepened, it became painfully clear that Japan held a sharp advantage, especially in the skies. Their aircraft were faster, their pilots better trained, and their tactics far more modern. Desperate to close the gap, Chinese leaders searched the world for skilled aviators who could help train their new pilots, many of whom were learning to fly recently acquired American aircraft. One of those volunteers was Robert Macaulay Short, a former U.S. Navy pilot demonstrating a Boeing biplane for the Chinese. After witnessing the destruction unfolding around him and the world's slow response, Short made a personal decision in early 1932. He would step into the fight himself. Flying over Shanghai, he attacked a group of Japanese fighters from the carrier Hosho. damaging their leader before they managed to break away. Days later, while relocating to Nanking, Short encountered 3 Japanese bombers. He dove in, shot one down, but was soon caught by their escorting fighters. His aircraft was struck, burst into flames, and crashed near Suzhou. Though acting privately, Short became, almost symbolically, the first American to down a Japanese aircraft and the first American to lose his life in combat with Japan. By May 1933, exhausted negotiators from China and Japan agreed to a ceasefire, leaving Manchuria and parts of northern China firmly under Tokyo's control. Japan's victory in Manchuria gave the empire a prized foothold, but the political cost was steep. After facing global criticism with no real consequences behind it, Japan walked out of the League of Nations. Reports of harsh treatment toward Chinese civilians spread across the world, yet little was done to stop the violence. Along the frontiers, small clashes continued for years, often sparked by Chinese partisan fighters resisting Japanese rule. Then on the night of July 7, 1937, shots were exchanged near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. No one can say with certainty who fired first, but tension and confusion quickly ignited a full battle. Within days, the conflict spiraled, turning into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Conscripts under Japanese command rebelled, killing soldiers and civilians as anger flared on all sides. The Japanese response was devastating. As their forces pushed deeper into China, brutality followed. Town after town fell under horrific violence, but nothing compared to the terror unleashed when Japanese troops reached Nanking. Refugees had flooded into the city seeking safety, only to face unimaginable suffering. Historian Iris Cheng would later describe the tragedy as a chilling example of what happens when military ambition slips into cruelty. Western nations watched with alarm. Though officially neutral, they maintained small military presences to protect their citizens and trade routes. Along the Yangtze River, American and British gunboats patrolled constantly, dodging sniper fire from warring factions. One of these ships was the USS Panay, built in China and tasked with escorting American vessels. By 1937, fears rose that Japanese aircraft might mistake the Panay for a Chinese vessel, so it sailed with large American flags draped across its decks. In December, as Japanese troops approached Nanking, American and British ships began evacuating embassy staff. The Panay joined 3 American merchant ships and moved upriver to avoid the fighting, its presence duly reported to Japanese authorities. But on December 12, Japanese aircraft were ordered to attack all river traffic. Despite its markings, the Panay and the merchant ships were bombed and strafed. 2 bombs struck the American gunboat before machine gun fire tore across its decks. By late afternoon, the ship slipped beneath the river. 4 men were killed and many more wounded before British vessels rescued the survivors. The attack came nearly 4 years before Pearl Harbor, but it was an early sign of what lay ahead. Meanwhile, American missionaries in the region recorded the horrors surrounding them, describing scenes of unimaginable suffering as civilians were tortured, murdered, and assaulted in the chaos of war.
The exact death toll from the rape of Nanking remains disputed even today. Estimates range widely, from around 30,000 victims to nearly 500,000, fueling a lasting political divide between China and Japan. American businesses and properties weren't spared either. Japanese troops looted, burned, and destroyed with little restraint. After the USS Panay incident, Japanese commanders became slightly more cautious about mistreating Americans, but tensions were already high. When U.S. Consul John Moore Allison was slapped by a Japanese soldier, Tokyo issued a quick apology. Still, to many Americans, the slap wasn't just an insult to one man. It felt like an insult to the entire country. Public sentiment began to shift sharply. In Australia and the United States, people who once viewed the conflict in China with indifference now saw Japan as a growing threat. Australian dock workers refused to load Japanese ships with resources that could support the ongoing war. Chinese communities in the U.S. organized fundraisers and raised awareness about the atrocities their families back home were enduring. But in Tokyo, none of this mattered. Japan ignored foreign criticism and continued expanding its military strength. Naval treaties meant to limit shipbuilding were openly disregarded. Britain and the Netherlands were increasingly concerned, but with Europe edging toward war, especially with Hitler's rise, Asia was no longer their top priority.
Meanwhile, American neutrality created a strange moral dilemma. Despite condemning Japanese actions, U.S. companies still sold Japan large quantities of steel, scrap metal, and oil. In April 1939, economist Maxwell S. Stewart stood before Congress and bluntly stated that America's neutrality was a farce. Japanese bombers, he argued, were flying with American materials and American fuel. The message was uncomfortable, but true. The U.S. was indirectly enabling Japan's war effort. While Americans focused more on the crises unfolding in Europe, Japan was fighting another dangerous battle, this time with the Soviet Union. Skirmishes along the Manchurian-Soviet border escalated into full-scale war on May 11, 1939. By the time the conflict ended in mid-September, the Japanese Sixth Army had been devastated, losing around 8,000 soldiers. The Soviets suffered even heavier casualties, but they achieved their strategic goal of securing the border. For Japan, the defeat was a turning point. The Northern Expansion Plan, pushing into Siberia for land and oil, was effectively dead. Tokyo realized that while its soldiers might be better trained, the Soviet Union had far more manpower and resources. To avoid another disaster, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the USSR in early 1941. This freed the army to continue its brutal campaign in China, while the Navy shifted its attention fully toward the Southern Expansion Plan. Then in September 1939, Europe went up in flames as World War II began. By June 1940, Germany had conquered France and the Netherlands, leaving their vast Asian colonies vulnerable. With European powers defeated or distracted, Japan saw an opening. On September 22, 1940, Japanese troops entered northern French Indochina, modern Vietnam. Their goal was simple: cut off Chinese supply lines coming through the port of Haiphong. 4 days later, the region was firmly under Japanese control, marking another major step in Tokyo's march across Asia. The following day, Japan aligned itself with Germany and Italy, joining the Axis powers. The announcement sent tremors through both London and Washington, raising urgent questions about what this new alliance might mean for global stability. Anticipating such a move, President Roosevelt had already instructed Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, to shift the fleet's primary base from San Diego to Pearl Harbor on Oahu, Hawaii, an unmistakable signal meant to deter any Japanese advances toward American interests. The United States remained conflicted about maintaining neutrality, yet its sympathies leaned strongly toward opposing Nazi Germany. That sentiment now naturally extended to Japan through its partnership with Berlin and Rome. Diplomatic messages flew across capitals as American and British officials pressed Tokyo for assurances that it would not threaten Allied territories in Asia. But over the coming months, relations only grew more strained. Frustrated by Japan's continued military expansion, the United States began tightening export restrictions, first on aircraft parts and scrap metal. These measures hindered Japan's war production but did not halt it. Then in June 1941, Japan's army advanced into southern Indochina. In response, Washington imposed a full oil embargo in July, cutting off a resource vital to Japan's military operations. Faced with this crisis, Tokyo began eyeing the oil-rich Dutch East Indies as a replacement source. Sensing the danger, President Roosevelt warned that the United States would take action should Japan make further aggressive moves, and insisted that Japan begin withdrawing from mainland Asia. But for the powerful Japanese military establishment, retreating was out of the question. As diplomats exchanged proposals and counter-proposals across the Pacific in hopes of easing the crisis, Japanese military leaders quietly concluded that conflict with the United States was becoming inevitable and began planning accordingly. One of the central figures shaping Japanese naval strategy was Isoroku Yamamoto. Born on April 4, 1884, he graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at age 20, specializing in naval gunnery, still the backbone of naval warfare even as torpedoes and submarines emerged. He first distinguished himself at the Battle of Tsushima, where he was wounded, and his rising career soon led to prestigious overseas assignments, including studies at Harvard University and service at the Japanese Embassy in Washington. Colleagues, both Japanese and American, frequently remarked upon his love of gambling and his uncanny skill at games of chance.
Although his early career seemed traditional, Yamamoto proved to be one of the few military leaders of his time who fully recognized the transformative potential of aviation in naval warfare. Japan acquired its first naval aircraft in 1910 and commissioned its first carrier, Hosho, in 1922. Yet, as with other major navies, aviation was still viewed merely as support for battleships. Determined to change this, Yamamoto shifted his focus in 1924 to naval aviation, first leading the Aeronautics Department and later commanding the 1st Carrier Division. Japan's push to build a modern carrier fleet received an early boost from the British-led Sempil mission, a government-approved initiative that allowed British pilots and engineers to assist Japan's aviation development. Led by Scottish aristocrat Lord William Forbes Sempil, the mission helped Japan refine its carrier operations and provided aircraft models that inspired future Japanese designs. However, the cooperation was short-lived. The mission ended after just 18 months, but its influence had already helped launch Japan's formidable naval aviation program.
In the brief span of the Sempil mission, Japan had already absorbed a significant amount of technical expertise. Even after the mission officially ended, Lord Sempil continued to funnel information about British military advancements to Japan, directly violating the British Official Secrets Act. Although his espionage activities were uncovered, his political connections shielded him from prosecution, and throughout the 1930s, he continued quietly promoting Japanese interests. Meanwhile, Yamamoto, now an admiral, understood that carrier power alone would not be enough to forge the formidable naval strike force he envisioned. To compensate for the limitations of 1930s carrier aircraft, he ordered the creation of a large fleet of twin-engine, land-based torpedo bombers to support naval operations until more advanced carrier aircraft could be developed. By 1940, thanks to Sempil's illicit technical assistance and Yamamoto's strategic doctrine, Japan had built the world's most powerful naval aviation arm. It boasted 6 fleet carriers, 3 smaller carriers, and a dedicated training carrier, all backed by a formidable array of land-based bomber forces. Japan was now capable of challenging the very nations that had once been its allies. Yet Yamamoto himself was far from eager to fight Britain, France, the Netherlands, or the United States, especially while Japan remained bogged down in its war in China. His deep understanding of America made him uniquely qualified to plan a war against them, but it also made him painfully aware of the inherent dangers. He knew that in manpower, resources, and industrial capacity, the United States held overwhelming advantages. Although America's focus on Hitler's advances in Europe temporarily diluted its Pacific strength, Yamamoto understood that once war broke out, much of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet would shift to the Pacific. More troubling still was America's massive industrial base, which, unlike Japan's, did not depend heavily on imported strategic materials and would be far more resilient to submarine or aerial disruption. Taking all this into account, Yamamoto concluded that if Japan went to war, it would have a window of no more than 6 months, 12 at the absolute maximum, to deliver a crippling blow that would force the United States into negotiations. Only then could Japan hope to secure control of the Pacific and establish its envisioned empire, the so-called co-prosperity sphere. If decisive victory did not come within that narrow time frame, he believed Japan was doomed, as once America fully mobilized, Japan could never compete with its industrial output. His grim assessment angered many within the Japanese army leadership, who clung to an unwavering belief in Japan's fighting spirit and superiority. But with political momentum pushing firmly toward war, Yamamoto had little choice but to proceed. He understood that Japan's opening strike would need to be overwhelmingly decisive, shattering American resistance long enough for Japan to expand across the Pacific with minimal opposition. By the late 1930s, Japan's Navy had already begun imagining how a war with the United States might unfold. Much of their planning focused on a large-scale invasion of the Philippines, a strategic American territory. From there, U.S. forces could threaten Japan's vital sea lanes and launch attacks against the expanding empire. The Japanese strategy relied on quickly overwhelming the American troops stationed in the islands, fortifying the archipelago, and using it as a springboard to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet once it mobilized from Pearl Harbor. But Yamamoto saw the flaw. Facing the full strength of American battleships and carriers in the midst of a Philippines campaign, Japan would be drawn into a prolonged naval war, time the United States could use to build its unmatched industrial power. Seeking an alternative, he began entertaining the radical idea of a preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor, aiming to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one decisive blow. Inspiration came from a report of a daring British attack on November 11, 1940. Using antiquated, very swordfish biplanes, the Royal Navy had struck the Italian fleet in Taranto harbor. The Italians had assumed shallow waters and early detection would protect them, but the British planes inflicted severe damage, taking the fleet out of the fight for months. This was precisely the kind of blow Yamamoto envisioned against America. He proposed a massive strike on Pearl Harbor, combining 6 Japanese fleet carriers with the latest torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. The goal was clear. First, neutralize the American aircraft defending the harbor, then destroy the battleships and carriers. Many Japanese generals opposed the plan, arguing that committing so much of Japan's carrier strength, nearly 60% of their fleet, was too risky. Yamamoto countered firmly. If the Pacific Fleet survived, Japan would eventually lose any war with America. His strategy won the day, and preparations for the attack began. The plan faced technical challenges. Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, less than 100 feet in many areas, would cause torpedoes to bury themselves in mud. The Americans, confident torpedoes posed no threat, had not installed protective nets. British planes had solved a similar problem at Taranto by flying slow and low, but Japanese monoplane torpedo bombers could not do the same. Japanese engineers devised an ingenious solution: wooden fins attached to the nose and tail of the torpedoes, reducing their dive depth at water entry. By April 1941, Imperial Japanese Navy pilots began practicing mock attacks on captured U.S. ships. A detailed model of Pearl Harbor was built, allowing admirals to refine every aspect of the assault. Intelligence was crucial. Lieutenant Teo Yoshikawa, posing as a tourist, was sent to Oahu to observe the harbor. With the large Japanese-American population drawing little attention, he spent hours in tea houses overlooking the fleet, noting ship movements, airfield routines, and vessel types. On one daring occasion, he hired a sightseeing plane to photograph the harbor from the air, completing a remarkably detailed picture of America's Pacific defenses. All the intelligence gathered by young Teo Yoshikawa in Hawaii was sent back to Tokyo, where it was woven into the final attack plans. As preparations neared completion, Japan decided to include small, 2-man submarines intended to slip into the harbor under the chaos of the air assault and launch torpedoes while American crews were distracted. The final strategy called for 6 aircraft carriers to approach Oahu from the north under the cover of darkness, launching 2 waves of aircraft in the early hours to strike the harbor and its defenses by surprise. A third wave would be ready to sweep up any remaining targets, leaving Pearl Harbor crippled.
There were whispers among some Japanese leaders of going further, even invading Hawaii itself, but such plans were ultimately abandoned.
Even as November approached, a slim hope of diplomacy lingered. On November 20th, Japan sent a last offer: withdraw from northern Indochina and halt expansion in southeast China if the U.S. lifted sanctions and supplied fuel. Washington countered, demanding full Japanese withdrawal from mainland China, a demand Tokyo could never accept. By late November, Yamamoto had assembled his immense fleet: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, and submarines. But at its heart were 6 fleet carriers under Admiral Nagumo, carrying over 400 aircraft. On November 26, 1941, the fleet sailed out from Japan under Yamamoto's command, beginning the long, silent journey across 12,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. Every ship observed strict radio silence, the only communications coming in coded transmissions from Tokyo, minimizing any chance of detection. Ahead of the main force, Japanese submarines scouted the waters for American ships, while the Pacific's vast expanse offered some cover. On the American side, intelligence officers were focused on the Philippines, correctly predicting an attack there, but failing to consider Pearl Harbor. Less than a day after Yamamoto's fleet departed, warnings were issued to U.S. forces in the Pacific. Yet, despite repeated alerts, the true scale and target of Japan's plan remained unknown.
As Admiral William Halsey would later reflect, warnings about Japanese movements had become so frequent that people had grown numb to them, treating each new alert with a shrug. Even though intelligence suggested the Philippines might be Japan's main target, Admiral Kimmel did what he could to prepare Pearl Harbor. His efforts were hampered by the fact that many of his long-range patrol aircraft had been reassigned to the Atlantic, leaving him with too few planes to scan the vast ocean surrounding Oahu. Kimmel concentrated his patrols on key shipping lanes and the areas where warships trained, expecting submarine attacks, but this focus inadvertently helped Yamamoto's fleet slip through undetected
expected. Further inland, Army Lieutenant General Walter C. Short interpreted the warnings from Washington less as a sign of an imminent attack and more as potential sabotage by local Japanese immigrants. He ordered aircraft at the airfields to be grouped together for easier guarding, a decision met with incredulity by soldiers who knew the Japanese-American population and doubted they would engage in espionage. The lack of unified command over U.S. forces on Oahu and the widespread underestimation of the threat left the base vulnerable. Most believed any attack would come through the Philippines, and precautions to defend Pearl Harbor itself were minimum. In effect, the Americans had left the door open for Yamamoto's strike. On December 2, 1941, aboard the battleship Nagato in Hiroshima Bay, Yamamoto issued the order, "Climb Mount Nitaka." It was the signal to launch the attack on Pearl Harbor. The plan's success hinged on destroying America's 3 Pacific carriers, the Enterprise, the Saratoga, and the Lexington. Yet in a cruel twist of fate for the Japanese, the carriers were not in the harbor. The Saratoga was back in California for refitting. Enterprise had departed on November 28th to deliver Marine F-4F Wildcat fighters to Wake Island, and Lexington had left 2 days prior for Midway. Yamamoto's carefully calculated gamble had, in one sense, already missed its mark. Despite this, the attack proceeded. The Japanese carriers could still strike a devastating blow against battleships, cruisers, and airfields, softening the American fleet for future engagements. On the evening of December 6th, American codebreakers intercepted a flurry of coded messages across the Pacific. Unsure of their meaning, they expected Japanese movements towards Southeast Asia and the Philippines. No one at Pearl Harbor anticipated what was about to unfold as the sun rose over Oahu the next morning.
On the northern tip of Oahu, the morning is roused not by danger, but by the shrill alarm of a clock inside the tents of Privates George E. Elliott, Jr. and Joseph L. Lockhart. They rise groggily, preparing to begin their duties at one of the island's 6 mobile radar stations. Set atop Opana, 532 feet above sea level, the site gives the 2 men a sweeping view of the surrounding Pacific. Their SCR-270 radar, an early warning marvel of the era, hums quietly. Unlike the circular, sweeping radar images we imagine today, this one relied on an oscilloscope that produced spikes whenever something appeared in the sky, enough to signal a presence, but nothing more. The operators are on a 24-hour shift, though the radar is only actively monitored from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., primarily for training. The rest of the time is spent on maintenance or guarding the equipment from curious locals. It is quiet work, and the morning passes largely unnoticed. Out at sea, another drama is quietly unfolding. At 5:57 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward, a Wicks-class ship under the newly appointed command of Lieutenant Commander William W. Outerbridge, patrols the waters around Oahu. Lookouts spot another U.S. ship, the minesweeper USS Condor, signaling that they believe they've seen a periscope slicing through the waves. Outerbridge immediately orders a search, suspecting a possible Japanese submarine lurking nearby. By 6 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes begins taking off from their carriers under Commander Mitsuo Fushida. 183 aircraft, divided into 3 groups, ascend into the morning sky. 2 groups are tasked with attacking airfields surrounding Pearl Harbor, while the primary formation aims straight for Battleship Row. Meanwhile, aboard the battleship USS Nevada, officer of the deck Joseph K. Umo Jr. is roused from sleep. It is a quiet Sunday morning in port, and the duties are usually dull. Looking for something to occupy his time, he orders a second boiler to be lit, unaware that the day will soon turn into one of history's most infamous attacks. At 6:30 a.m., across the harbor, the USS Enterprise launches its own planes, not Japanese this time, but American. 18 Douglas SBD dive bombers lift off, conducting a routine patrol over 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor before returning to Ford Island. A storm had delayed the carrier's arrival by a full day, a twist of fate that would spare it from the morning's devastation. At 6:37 a.m., the USS Ward spotted another vessel, a U.S. Navy supply ship, the Antares, towing a 500-ton barge near the harbor entrance. A delayed tug forces the ship to alter its course, keeping the channel clear. That's when crew members noticed a small white wake trailing behind, an unmistakable periscope. Quickly, the Antares signaled its location to the Ward. Outerbridge reacts instantly. General quarters is sounded. The Ward moves to intercept, joined by a PBY Catalina overhead, which drops smoke bombs to mark the submarine's position. The destroyer opens fire with its 4-inch deck guns, then speeds ahead to drop depth charges. The result is swift and lethal. The Japanese submarine is destroyed, and its 2 crew members perish beneath the waves. It is a small clash, almost a footnote compared to what is about to unfold. Yet for those on the northern shores of Oahu and in the waters surrounding the island, it is the first tangible sign that the long months of tension are about to explode into history. As the USS Ward reported its encounter with the submarine, a coded message was sent to Pearl Harbor, but by the time it reached Admiral Kimmel, precious minutes had already slipped by. Kimmel, cautious and weary of false alarms, demanded verification, unsure if the report signaled real danger or simply a mistake. Meanwhile, atop Opana Point, Privates George Elliott and Joseph Lockard were wrapping up their early morning radar watch. Elliott, new to the unit, had spent much of the shift at the plotting table, marking imaginary tracks on the map as Lockard guided him. The day had been quiet, almost painfully so. With their relief crew expected and thoughts turning to breakfast, the two men decided to get in a little extra training. Elliott took his position at the oscilloscope, Lockard coaching him as they scanned a horizon. For most of the morning, the screen remained stubbornly flat, but suddenly, a spike appeared, sharp, undeniable, and unlike anything they had ever seen. Lockard's eyes widened. The radar was picking up an enormous formation of aircraft, far larger than anything either of them had ever encountered. Heart pounding, they immediately radioed Fort Shafter and Honolulu to report the sighting. Private Joseph McDonald, attempting to locate Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, delivered the alarming news, only to be met with dismissal. Tyler insisted it was nothing, explaining that they were simply expecting B-17 flying fortresses to arrive from the mainland. Neither Lockard, Elliott, nor McDonald were convinced. Recognizing the urgency in McDonald's voice, Tyler was pressed to take the report seriously, but ultimately, the young men were told to stand down. McDonald returned to his tent, a grim expression shadowing his face. When a fellow soldier asked him what troubled him, he muttered quietly, "The Japs are coming." By 7:26 a.m., the destroyer USS Helm slipped its moorings, setting out for routine maintenance patrols around the harbor. A little later, at 7:40 a.m., Elliott and Lockard lost track of the massive formation they had first spotted over 30 minutes earlier. A truck arrived to take them back to the main base, just as the morning air began to tremble with the first distant booms. At 7:48 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fushida gave the order, and the attack commenced. The Pacific Fleet, groggy and still easing into the day, heard the roar of aircraft engines and assumed it was routine training. On the USS Nevada, bands were playing, flags were being hoisted, and the morning seemed ordinary until the first explosions shattered the calm. Battleship Row was hit immediately. The USS Oklahoma took 2 torpedo strikes that ripped through her hull, followed minutes later by a third hit that nearly capsized the ship. The USS West Virginia endured 7 torpedo hits, while the USS California suffered 2 devastating blows almost simultaneously. Then the Japanese dive bombers arrived, unleashing modified 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs. The USS Arizona was struck with terrifying precision. One bomb detonated near the ship's magazines, tearing the vessel in two in a catastrophic explosion. Nearby, the heavy cruiser USS Helena was hit by a torpedo after being mistaken for Admiral Kimmel's flagship, the USS Pennsylvania. The blast damaged the mine layer USS Oglala, which began taking on water while repeated strafing attacks prevented any efforts at saving the ship. Another cruiser, the USS Raleigh, was also struck, listing dangerously as it began to sink. In those first minutes, the calm Sunday morning of Pearl Harbor dissolved into chaos, marking the beginning of a surprise attack that would etch itself into history.
Chaos erupted across Pearl Harbor as American sailors scrambled to man their stations, firing at the incoming Japanese planes with whatever weapons they could find. The gunners along Battleship Row faced a nearly impossible task. The ships were so tightly packed that every shot risked hitting a friendly vessel. Ammunition ran out quickly, forcing crew members to dash below decks to bring up fresh rounds while under fire. In the air, Japanese Zero fighters exploited the lack of American aircraft overhead, strafing the defensive gunners with deadly accuracy. On land, the Army airfields at Barbers Point, Bellows, Hickam, and Wheeler bore the brunt of the assault. Aircraft that had been clustered together to prevent sabotage were now sitting ducks, torn apart by bombs and machine gun fire. At Wheeler Field, pilots like Lieutenant Phil Rasmussen found themselves scrambling in pajamas, grabbing whatever weapons were at hand to fight back. Amid the devastation, some aircraft had miraculously survived, and the pilots hurriedly armed and fueled them.
Rasmussen himself climbed into his P-36, its guns already jammed and clearly outmatched by the Japanese Zeros, yet he still managed to bring one fighter down. Across Wheeler Field, the American pilots accounted for 11 Japanese aircraft. A brave effort, but a mere drop in the ocean compared to the waves of attackers raining down on them. Into this chaos arrived the SBD dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, arriving over Pearl Harbor to witness the devastation firsthand. Confused and under fire from both Japanese planes and American gunners who struggled to tell friend from foe, 7 of the SBDs were shot down before they could even land. The B-17s that Lieutenant Tyler had been expecting faced similar confusion and were forced to divert to other airfields, many suffering damage from both Japanese attacks and friendly fire. At 8:17 a.m., the destroyer USS Helm, initially scheduled for routine maintenance patrols, attempted to leave the harbor to find safer waters. A lookout soon spotted an unusual object snagged on a nearby reef, a small 2-man Japanese submarine. Helm opened fire, but the sub slipped free, only to become entangled again on the reef. Its crew abandoned it. One man drowned, while the other, Kazuo Sakamaki, would become the first Japanese prisoner of war held by the United States. Just minutes later, the USS Monahan, another destroyer heading out to assist the ward, encountered its own peril. Spotting a second Japanese submarine attempting to strike the fleet, the captain ordered full speed ahead, aiming to ram it. The destroyer missed by mere yards, then dropped depth charges into the shallow water. The resulting blasts were so powerful that Monahan's stern lifted from the waves, damaging the ship's steering, yet it had at least disrupted the submarine's attack. Out of control, the USS Monahan scraped against a barge, suffering only minor damage, before continuing its desperate dash out of the harbor. By 8:30 a.m., aboard the destroyer USS Alwyn, chaos reigned. With much of her crew, including senior officers, ashore, the ship steamed away with less than half her regular complement. Command fell to a young ensign Stanley B. Kaplan, who had only 8 months at sea. Now, under relentless fire, he was leading a destroyer through the heart of the attack. As lookouts spotted the ship's captain boarding a motor launch, Kaplan ignored orders to stop. He had been instructed to press on. Gunners opened fire on Japanese planes overhead, trying to keep the vessel moving. After nearly 45 minutes of near-constant attack, Battleship Row was ablaze, the first wave of Japanese warplanes turning for their carriers, but the second wave loomed on the horizon. Meanwhile, aboard the heavily damaged USS Nevada, flooding from a torpedo hit threatened to leave the battleship a sitting target. Yet, thanks to Ensign Taig's quick thinking in lighting an additional boiler, the ship powered free of her moorings in just 40 minutes, cutting through the channel and evading the worst of the attack. By 8:54 a.m., the second wave of Japanese aircraft struck, comprising 35 fighters, 78 dive bombers, and 54 high-altitude bombers. This time, the Americans were ready, engaging the attackers head-on. Unlike the first wave, these pilots did not enjoy the element of surprise, and their losses were heavier, a reality not lost on Admiral Naguno as he watched his forces struggle against prepared defenses. By 9:50 a.m., the USS Nevada was under repeated bombing runs. 5 Japanese 250-kilogram bombs struck her as she tried to escape to open waters, setting fires that threatened the crew as much as the enemy. The battleship endured, but the damage was severe. By 10 a.m., with fuel running low and aircraft spent, the last Japanese pilots returned to their carriers, expecting a third wave of attacks that never came. Admiral Naguno had canceled it, reasoning that their primary objectives, battleships and shore facilities, had largely been achieved, and further strikes would risk too many planes and pilots ahead of the inevitable confrontation with the American carriers. By 10:30 a.m., despite the crew's valiant efforts, the fires aboard the Nevada prevented effective damage control. Fearing the battleship might sink, she was deliberately grounded near Ford Island with the aid of a tug and a minesweeper, becoming immobile but avoiding total loss. Back in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was receiving the news of Pearl Harbor in real time. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had burst into a meeting with the president and advisor Harry Hopkins, announcing that Japan was attacking. Recalling the moment, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt noted her husband's demeanor, calm, measured, and focused, absorbing the grim reports and preparing to lead a nation into a conflict that would change the course of history.
Eleanor Roosevelt knew, deep down, that her husband was furious. After all the effort he had put into seeking a peaceful resolution with Japan, the nation had been blindsided. What made the attack even more infuriating was the timing. 7.5 hours after bombs rained down on Pearl Harbor, Japan formally delivered its declaration of war against the United States and Great Britain. That same day, British territories in the Far East, including Hong Kong, came under assault. Speaking to Roosevelt from London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill acknowledged the grim reality, telling him, "We are all in the same boat now." Roosevelt confided in Eleanor that he expected Germany to follow its Japanese allies and declare war soon. He admitted that America was unprepared for the scale of the conflict and that it would take months to shift the nation's industry from making cars and refrigerators to producing tanks, planes, and bombs. "We will have to take a good many defeats before we can achieve victory," he told her. That evening, Eleanor went on the radio for her weekly broadcast, addressing a nation that was shocked, frightened, and angry. Calm but resolute, she reassured listeners, saying, "Whatever is asked of us, we shall accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States." While she spoke to the country, Roosevelt worked with his secretary, Grace Tully, dictating a speech he planned to deliver to Congress the next day. In the evening, he met with his cabinet to review the latest reports from Pearl Harbor. The news was grim. Casualty numbers were climbing with every transmission, and the Pacific Fleet had suffered devastating losses. Yet there was one small relief: the aircraft carriers, the most crucial strike force, had survived intact. On the afternoon of December 8, 1941, Roosevelt addressed Congress at 12:30 p.m., declaring that a state of war now existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire following the unprovoked attack. Within an hour, Congress voted almost unanimously to declare war on Japan. The lone dissenting voice came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress. Standing firm despite jeers from the gallery, she explained, "As a woman, I can't go to war and I refuse to send anyone else." Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, the carrier USS Enterprise sailed into the devastated harbor on the afternoon of December 8th. The crew saw the destruction firsthand, battleships burning and listing, debris everywhere. The day before, they had launched a scouting mission after reports of a possible Japanese fleet sighting, but had found nothing. Now, driven by the desire for revenge and the urgency to be ready for a second attack, the crew hurriedly refueled, rearmed, and resupplied the carrier, preparing to return to sea. Across the Pacific and the United States, one thought consumed the minds of those who had witnessed the attack and those who had only heard of it: avenge Pearl Harbor. By the end of that fateful day, 2,335 U.S. service members and 68 civilians had lost their lives. Over 1,100 were wounded. 4 battleships were sunk, another 4 heavily damaged, and numerous cruisers and other support vessels destroyed. Nearly 390 aircraft were lost. For the men and women of the U.S. military and for a nation reeling in shock, the attack had set the stage for a war that would demand every ounce of courage, resolve, and ingenuity the United States could muster. And yet, the survival of the American aircraft carriers meant that Japan's gamble had only bought them a short window, a mere 6 months, as Yamamoto had predicted, to achieve a decisive victory over the Allies. That window would close far sooner than they imagined. Just 6 months later, at the Battle of Midway, in June 1942, 4 of the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were sunk by American air power. It was a staggering defeat, one from which Japan would never fully recover, and it marked the turning point that set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Japanese Empire in 1945. For the United States, Pearl Harbor left a mark that went far beyond the immediate destruction. The memory of that Sunday morning shaped military strategy for decades. As the Cold War emerged and tensions with the Soviet Union rose, the U.S. lived in constant vigilance against the threat of surprise attacks, now potentially nuclear in nature. Billions were poured into early warning systems, intelligence networks, and rapid response technologies. A massive rearmament program ensured that, unlike December 7, 1941, the United States would always be prepared to defend itself. And while the lessons of Pearl Harbor were learned in steel and fire, they also reshaped America's approach to global politics. Where once the country had hesitated in the 1930s, it now adopted a far more assertive stance, determined not to be caught off guard again. The attack also left a lingering shadow of questions and speculation. Could the United States have known? Were warnings overlooked or even deliberately ignored?
Like many watershed moments in history, Pearl Harbor has sparked countless debates, some plausible, others bordering on the fantastic. One question continues to fascinate and divide: did President Roosevelt have any prior knowledge of the attack? What is indisputable, however, is the sheer magnitude of the event. Pearl Harbor was never just a military strike, it was a moment that reshaped the world. In a single, devastating sweep, it propelled the United States into the global conflict of World War II and set it on a path to becoming, in the decades to come, the most influential and arguably the most powerful nation on Earth.